But to get up on stage at the end of a service one Sunday and say, I can't lead you anymore because I don't believe this story, that was hard. It was a lot of tears up on stage.
Hey there, I'm Goli Kalkaran, and this is Lessons from a Quitter, where we believe that it's never too late to start over. No matter how much time or money you've spent getting to where you are, if ultimately you are not happy, then it's time to get out. If you're feeling stuck and you feel like there's gotta be more, there's gotta be a way to feel fulfilled and excited about what you do, then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I will sit down with an inspiring guest who quit their professional career in order to forge their own path and create a life that they love. Hello, and welcome back to another episode. I am so honored to have you back. Thank you for joining me today. If you haven't already reviewed the podcast, would you do me a favor and please take 2 minutes and just review it on whatever app you're listening to? It truly helps me out, and I really appreciate it. I am so excited about this episode. It is a little bit different, more of the same, but it covers a very, very important topic. And that's the topic of our identity. So often we have just come to equate what we do with who we are. And one of the biggest blocks in leaving is that we feel as though if we leave this career, then who are we even? Because we've known ourselves in that role for so long. Now, the reality of it is that clearly you are not what you do. You know, our identity is made up of so many different roles. We are children and mothers and siblings and to people and friends, and we do so many different things. And yes, we have an occupation, but if you walk away from that occupation, you are still that same person. Yet we have somehow convinced ourselves that because you were a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, that is intertwined in who you are. And it makes it really hard for us to figure out, like, how do I go from being this teacher to then not? What does that make me? What does that say about me? And there are a lot of hangups with that. Now, in today's episode, it's even one step further because so many of us do really identify with our religious beliefs, and they are a core part of who we are for a lot of people. And I was so excited to have Geoff Kullman on the show to talk about how he went from being a pastor to becoming an atheist and having to leave that profession. Now, before we jump in, I would like to make the disclaimer that this episode and this conversation has nothing to do with religious beliefs or other people's religious beliefs. It is not a discussion about whether they are right or wrong, or good or bad or anything like that. This is about Geoff's own personal belief and his own personal journey. So I in no way want to offend anybody. I'm not trying to make a statement about Christianity. We're just talking about his journey, because imagine how connected you feel to your profession if you are having a hard time leaving. And then imagine if that profession is something that it was a fundamental part of your entire life growing up in your household. He went to school to be a pastor. He got a degree in Bible studies. He spent his working life working either for churches, whether it was nonprofits. We'll talk about what his career trajectory looked like. And then ultimately to becoming a pastor, which was really his goal throughout his whole life, was to be a pastor. And he worked as a pastor for a number of years until he started having some fundamental questions about his own belief system. And he ultimately decided that he no longer believed in God. And we talk about that decision and having to face your family and wife and congregation and the people you work with and everybody who has accepted these beliefs and who also thought that you accepted those beliefs, to have to confront them. And so it's not just quitting a job, but it's literally just changing your entire identity. And he had to go from that to figuring out, like, now what? You know, like all of his experience, his degree, everything was tied into this identity and this religion. And he now had to figure out a way to start over. So it is an extremely interesting conversation. And I think it just shines a lot of light on how we view our identities and how much more malleable they are than we think they are. We think they are set in stone or they're rigid, and that is that. But there is really a lot of courage in saying that this doesn't fit me anymore and I want to try something else. And so I think Geoff's story and what he's gone on to do and create this incredible business that he'll talk about as a copywriter. And, in such a short amount of time, he only left his job about 2.5 years ago. So it's a very fascinating discussion. And I also think it just, maybe think about your own identity and what you assume is your identity and how much you assume that you have to keep with things because you've done them a certain way. And whether that's really true, whether you have the freedom to leave if you are not happy. So without further ado, let's jump in and tackle this really interesting conversation with Geoff. Hi, Geoff. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I know this is going to be really good and really helpful. So we like to kind of start, not all the way at the beginning, but why don't you tell us when you went to school, what the earlier part of your career looked like and how you kind of ended up there?
Yeah. And my career's gone totally backwards from probably most people, where most people start a career that's maybe about climbing the ladder or making a good amount of money. And then they pivot to something that's more purpose-based and gives them joy and all that. Mine's kind of gone in the opposite direction. So I started with all that purpose and giving back and all that good stuff. And now
you're after the money.
Back half of my career. And I'm like, okay, now I want to make money. And It's not all about charity. Not that it's all about making money, but yeah. So I'll start pretty early on. My journey to becoming a pastor obviously starts or not obviously, but in most cases, mine starts where my family, we grew up going to church. Our Christian faith was a big part of our identity as a family. And for me individually, my grandpa, even the sound booth at the back of the church literally has a plaque on it with his name, in honor of him. So yeah, that was a pretty big part of who we were and all that as we were growing up. So as I grew up and as I, graduated high school, I had this stirring in the religious world. We'd say we felt called to this direction of becoming a pastor and working in a church and being the one that stands up at the front and gives the sermon, gives the talk, and teaches people all that stuff, serves people throughout the week and all that. So yeah, once high school was done, the next step was fairly obvious for me, which was I need to go to Bible college, which is, if you're unfamiliar, is college where you focus on the Bible, learning all about it, learning how to teach it, those types of things. So yeah, that's where it all started. For me, it was getting all the training that I needed, getting the degrees that I needed, getting the work experience, kind of internships that I needed through Bible college, and the whole way kind of feeling that this is the direction that I'm being pulled towards and that my life's going to just be about being a pastor and serving other people and going wherever I'm needed and that type of thing. So that was the earliest stages of my career advancement, I guess you'd say.
And so you became a pastor, and how long did you work as a pastor?
Yeah, so actually, after I graduated college, once I had that degree in my hand, I realized I'm 22 years old. I am in no way fit to lead other people, which was this moment of this flash in a pan moment of maturity for a 22-year-old. But I realized this wasn't, I had all the training and I had all the knowledge, a little bit of experience even, but not the maturity or wisdom. So I went instead of straight to being a pastor, I went instead to an organization that basically you continue to get training about teaching other people about the faith, but also then you travel the world and tell people about this Jesus guy. Mm-hmm. And so that was what I did for a little while, as well as traveling the world, telling people about this faith that we wanted to share. And then when I got back home, went into the nonprofit world for about 7 or 8 years, mostly in fundraising and faith-based nonprofits, but, helping them pay the bills through fundraising. And it was a really good experience in that it helped me learn, how to work with boards and how to work with volunteers and things like that. So that was a really good experience as well. And then when I was in my late 20s, late 20s, early 30s, something like that. That's when it was, okay, I'm finally, I think, to this point of maturity or readiness or whatever to actually go into pastoral work. So
did you know, like, as you were in the nonprofit world or as you were doing, some level of, I mean, it's not corporate, but like just in kind of regular jobs, was the goal always, though, to ultimately become a pastor?
yeah, and I remember saying even in one of my first interviews, one of my last interviews to get into this nonprofit, where I'm finally on location for an interview and saying this is going to set me up really well for the pastoral work that I want to do because, like I said, the boards and the volunteers and putting others' needs ahead of my own and those types of things. So the goal was always to get into the pastoral world and find a church eventually that would have me.
So you became a pastor, and how long did you ultimately end up working as a pastor?
It was, I think, again, about 6, 7 years in total. So part of that early on was part-time, and then just for a year was part-time, and then moved into full-time.
I mean, we're obviously going to get into your personal journey of how you were led away from faith or from your faith. But before we kind of get into like the external, all of the issues of telling people and dealing with family, and when did you start? Like, I know that your situation is a little bit unique. I think I'm sure there's pastors that maybe leave for whatever reasons, but you left because you became an atheist. And so at what point in that journey, when you're in this career, and we talk a lot about identity and talk about identity when it comes to religion and what you've been raised in and what your family is and what everyone around you is like. So like, where was the beginning of this kind of that led you away from this?
First off, I'm just by nature, I'm very analytical, a little bit critical as a person. So there was always, even growing up, there were always these doubts and, being critical of the faith that I was being brought up in. But I always saw that as part of my faith, as the doubts aren't unhealthy. And I still don't think they are necessarily, that it's healthy to ask questions and to push back a little bit, because then when you come to the other side of the thing, you have more knowledge, you have more wisdom, you have more understanding of the concept that you're trying to understand, whether it's some philosophical idea or some theological idea. But yeah, there was this guy named Rob Bell who wrote a book about essentially questioning the existence of hell, which is a rather core tenet of the Christian faith, that, there's heaven for people who believe the story and there's hell for those who don't. And so I won't get into all the theological nuances and all that. But yeah, that was probably, I don't know if it was the first, but it was certainly the largest push towards questioning the whole thing. And so I flew down to Laguna Beach to see Rob a couple of times. Not like one-on-one, I'm not that cool, right. But like at events. I wish. Yeah, where I'd go down and hear him talk about the same topic and expand upon that topic and how it affects and impacts every other aspect of your faith. And again, I was still at the point where I thought, these are healthy conversations. I can still believe in a loving God who didn't create a hell, and that's still okay as part of my faith. But it was simultaneously healthy and the beginning of the unraveling of everything.
And how long did that unraveling take? I mean, from when these like kind of first cracks to when you really, I do think it takes a lot of courage to come out and say that you're an atheist. I think so many of us get so deeply ingrained in these identities that even if we feel that, we try to shove it down or look away. And so I think to really stare at that in the face takes a lot of courage. But I'm sure it was a very long process. Like, how long did it kind of take you to really get to that point?
The funny thing is, I don't know if funny is the right word, but the funny thing is, as I look back on it, that Rob Bell experience was pretty early on. Once I actually became a pastor, it was maybe a year or two in when I read that book and went to those events, and things started to unravel. But again, for the longest time, I would see, this isn't unraveling, this is strengthening. And then it wasn't until some personal events started to actually happen, and friends and family around me, that it began to be a lot more personal and a lot less philosophical in terms of where these questions were heading. It became real. It wasn't about, is this theological idea correct or not? It became, is this story even true? And so, yeah, that was just a couple of years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, where that actually started to really unravel the whole thing. Went from being, this is strengthening my faith and this is healthy, to, I don't know what the hell this is. This is freaking me out.
Yeah. And when you're in that space, what did you do? Did you consult with other people? Did you reach out? Were you just kind of doing all this work internally and trying to make sense of your own thoughts? Or
I had a few people that I could talk about it with, one of them being my wife, she's amazing, first of all, but she's on a similar journey. She's just reached a different conclusion. For her, faith is still really important and really integral to who she is and how she lives and the stories that she wants to pass on to our kids. And so it's just great at having those conversations. It was still quite a shock for her when all of a sudden it was when I came to her and said, I don't think I believe any of this anymore. So that was one really important relationship, obviously. And through that time as well, I also changed churches. I stopped working at the church that was, well, it was actually the church where I grew up. It's the church where my grandpa's little plaque is. But, conservative evangelical church that I no longer really fit into in a bunch of ways. But I found a church that it was all about embracing the questions. It was a church meant for people who were deconstructing, kind of tearing apart their faith, and provided a healthy place, a safe space to do that. So I switched from working at one church to being a pastor at this other church where this was part of the DNA of the place of let's come together and ask questions and tear things apart and hopefully build things back up. So rather than being conservative evangelical, it was liberal and open, and conversations with the other pastor there really helpful as well. Again, it was quite a shock to him when it was, oh crap, these questions have turned into something completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to assume that there had to be a lot of fear wrapped up in this journey for you and like figuring out like, where is this leading me and how is this going to affect literally your whole life? Because in this type of a job, I mean, it's not just the identity of like the career. Obviously, it's like your personhood, like who you are and also your family. So I think a lot of times when there's that level of fear, we just try not to deal with it. So I'm just wondering like how you dealt with the fear of knowing that things are unraveling.
Yeah. The biggest fear wasn't around exploring questions. It wasn't around even losing faith. It was, well, partly was about telling my parents, but that's a whole separate story. Yeah. But mostly it was honestly, what do I do with my career now? I don't have any marketable skills. My entire career trajectory has been heading towards this. And now it's something I can't do anymore. But, putting on a resume that I have a bachelor's degree in biblical studies, or I now call it a BA and BS. But anyway, right? Like that's not really a marketable skill. Like HR directors will look at that and go, great, good luck, but no. So that was the biggest concern was what do I do with my career? Am I going to, be a barista at Starbucks for the rest of my life, or where do I go from here? So that was the biggest fear.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, that is a theme that comes up a lot on the podcast. And I think a lot of people that are dealing with wanting to make a switch have that same fear. And I don't even think that they have it. I think yours is much more founded in the sense that, like, you're right. We're not taught that like these degrees can be used in a lot of different ways. And so it feels like you were going down one path and now you're literally starting over from square one. And so I can see how that could be terrifying. But like before we get to like what you kind of did and how you figured out the career path, I'm going back to, I know it's so interesting when you talk about your wife and how you guys have kind of come to your own acceptance of different levels of faith and how you're navigating that as parents, because I think a lot of times people may not have, again, this level of a difference, but a lot of people are like wanting to switch careers and their spouse doesn't understand, because they are making a certain amount of money or, seems like a good job. And so there's a lot of fear about bringing that up, about wanting to start over, taking a pay cut and stuff. So can you tell us a little more about like how you guys are navigating this if she is, have her faith and want to like have that with your children and like you obviously don't believe in it. So how do you guys do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I quit my job. I quit my regular paycheck while she was off on maternity leave, which we're in Canada, we're Canadian. And so maternity leave isn't a few weeks or a few months, it's a year. And we were a long ways away still from her actually having a regular paycheck. So maternity leave in Canada is her place of employment has to keep her job for her for a year. And you go on, essentially the government pays you for the year about half of what you made before. So it's great, but it's still a financial hardship where she is all of a sudden making half the money that she used to make. And with me as a pastor, she was the breadwinner, made a lot more money than me. And so I say she's incredible just because it was never an issue for her. It was just,
Wow.
well, we'll figure this out. I can go back and substitute teach for a little bit if we need to. She was and always is, we'll make it work. We'll figure this out.
That's incredible.
We'll be fine. Yeah.
Right.
And not in like some cheesy God way, like God will take care of us. It's no, we'll work. We can pick up extra shifts. She can go back and substitute. I can do this or that. We'll just make it work. And so, yeah, she's always very supportive of that. I mean, it became, I think, really obvious that I just couldn't keep going in the church world. And so it wasn't a question of, well, let's make a 6-month plan, save up some money, and then, we can begin exploring what this might look like. It was, I go to work every day and literally, even still a couple of years later, like my body has physical reactions to thinking about certain topics. Like there's triggers where my shoulders will literally quiver. It was obvious I couldn't keep going. There was too much pain, too much rawness to it. And so she saw that and just said, we'll figure this out.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, she sounds like an incredible person, and it's so wonderful to have that support. Did it affect you guys' relationship in the sense that I imagine that when you guys got married or you were together, like obviously it's one thing to be a religious person. It's another thing to be a pastor. And that's part of like who she married, obviously like to come out and say like, I no longer believe in God. Was that difficult on like the relationship?
I have friends who have gone through a similar transition from someone working as a pastor to not believing in God anymore. And it has torn their marriage apart.
Yeah.
There's this, speaking of things that make my shoulders twitch, there's this thing of not being unequally yoked. A Christian shouldn't be married to a non-Christian. And I see the value in that and all that, but whatever.
Yeah.
We've never considered this all of a sudden not working. It's just, well, we have to find some different talking points, I guess. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. I love it. That's wonderful. But okay, so zooming out a little bit from your wife, and you were just saying like, obviously you're scared to tell your parents. Like, how did the rest of this go? Because obviously your family is religious and the people you were working with and, so you had to have a lot of difficult conversations, I presume. So how did that go when you were telling people you don't want to do this anymore?
Yeah. So my parents, I never told. They asked about a year later.
After you stopped working already?
After I stopped working already.
Oh.
They presumed, so I'd moved into this other career and just kind of always told them, well, this is where I want to go now. I've got a lot more potential to earn a really good living. And so that was always just the story that I told them. And they never really asked until finally one day they did. Yeah, telling people at church. I mean, we were a small church. Like some weeks there'd be like, I don't even know, 50 people there. And so it wasn't some mega church where, there'd be a few thousand people. It was, and it still is, a really tight-knit community of a church because it's all about, like I said, building a safe space where we could come and be raw and real and ask questions with each other. And so it was really, really difficult to get up on stage one Sunday after I'd already met with the staff and with the board, and they already knew what was going on. But to get up on stage at the end of a service one Sunday and say, I can't lead you anymore because I don't believe this story.
Oh my God.
That was hard. It was,
I bet.
It was a lot of tears up on stage. But the beautiful thing was the community that we had and the leadership from the board and the other pastor at the church. It was just fully supportive rather than you are now an atheist and you will go to hell. It was, we love you. And if you never believe what we believe again, you're still welcome here. We're going to pay you for a little bit and you can do some administration work, so you can pay some bills. It was beautiful. It was people sending me messages and,
that's wonderful.
And reaching out and seeing how I was doing and seeing if there was anything we needed. But never asking about what happened, like at least not yet, not pushing on finding out details or blaming me or how dare you, lead us in this and then say that you don't believe it. It was all just so supportive and yeah.
That is beautiful. That sounds beautiful. And it sounds obviously like what these places of worship should be, just this full acceptance of people. I think that's what an amazing way to kind of ease some of that fear. And I can't even imagine. I think so many of us are so afraid of quitting our job, and then to have to do it in that fashion, like on a stage, telling people, like literally having to go out in such a dramatic way of like telling people that your identity is no longer what they thought it was. It takes a lot of courage and coming up to it. Did you ever get to a place where you thought you couldn't do it or chickened out or like rethink it? Like, what am I doing? This might be crazy. I'm throwing away this entire life that I'd built for myself.
Yeah. I mean, you've said the word courage a few times. It honestly, for me, it wasn't about being courageous. It was just about being someone that has small degree, at least, of integrity. Once I knew that I no longer believed in God and could no longer pretend that I did, it wasn't courage. It was just, this is what I have to do. And so the only caveat to that was I really love Christmas. I'm like ridiculously addicted to Christmas.
As we all are.
Yeah. I'll start listening to Christmas music in the summer and then just keep going through until, and then December 26th hits and I just hate Christmas. I want it over. So I had to make it through Christmas as a pastor. I had to, one of the highlights of my year was always, I was the one that planned the entire Christmas service. And so I had to do that. I had to make it through. And again, we were a church that, was fine with singing Jingle Bells at a Christmas service or Santa Claus is coming to town. Like it was a fun, and we mixed that in with the religious songs and all that, but I had to make it through that. And then as soon as that was over, like shortly after Christmas, I sent a text to the lead pastor and to the chairperson of the board, said, I think we need to talk. And then the chairperson jokingly responded, oh no, you're quitting, aren't you? As a joke. And then there was this awkward pause where I didn't know what to say. And I said to my wife who's next to me, I said, oh crap, he called me on it. What do I do? And he was totally joking. But then the awkward pause was like, oh no, he really is. And so instead of meeting in a week or two, the three of us grabbed a beer that night, met up at a bar, and I laid it out there and said, I can't do this anymore. And so that's when they came up with the idea of, let's have you do some admin work behind the scenes, and so that you can still pay a few bills and we can transition and all that. But yeah, it was never a courageous thing. It was just, I need a modicum of integrity in my life. And so that made it necessary to tell.
Yeah. I mean, that seemed courageous to you. And I think that a lot of times it seems like you're doing what you need in order to live the life that you want to live. But I think it is courageous to other people, because I think that people want to live with integrity, but there's just this overwhelming fear, or the, fear of disappointing others and isolating yourself, or, not knowing, that keeps people in a place. And I think a lot of people really want to find that place where, regardless of the costs, which in your case seemed to be, could have been really high. Like you ended up having a really good reaction from your church. I don't think that's always the case. Nope. Or family, or, and you were saying like other people's marriages. I mean, people have paid a really steep price for really stepping into who they are. And I think that scares a lot of other people. Obviously, like, my personal opinion is that you should still do it, because like you were saying, like, you need to live in integrity with yourself. And regardless of what you say, I'm going to call it courageous. But okay, so then now kind of going away from, relationship aspect and the identity and putting yourself out there, you have this very real problem of figuring out, like, what am I going to do for a living? Like, you've only done this, your degree is in this. This is what your whole life has kind of been up until this point. And so how do you start figuring out the next step of, like, what skills do I have?
Well, ironically, while I was still working in church, probably 3 years before I left, I'd always had this entrepreneurial kind of spark in me. Even when I was a teenager, when I was like 14 or 15, I started up my first business it was just website design for companies. And in the mid to late 90s, that was a kind of a new thing. And so I didn't need to be that good at it. I just needed to actually know how to do it and get a few clients to pay me money to do that. And so I had this entrepreneurial side of me that needed to kind of be explored anyway, again. And so 3 years before I left the church world, I'd started this side business that was still within the church world. It was about training church leadership and pastors about the millennial generation, because millennials were leaving the church in droves, and churches needed, to shift their model and approach. And that's the type of stuff that I was teaching them. The ironic thing is that I am a millennial who then left church, even though I was teaching pastors how to keep millennials in church. So as a part of that side business, I had, I needed to learn how to market the thing, how to get the word out to other churches to hire me, to bring me on, to buy some of my teaching products, things like that. And so I had done a lot of work, a lot of research into this whole marketing thing, including getting some certifications and investing pretty heavily on trainings. And so when it came time to be the millennial who left the church myself, I had this knowledge and a bit of experience in marketing my own side business that it just became kind of a natural transition to, well, if I don't have any marketable skills to find another job, maybe this is what I can lean into instead. Because, once I started learning how to market myself, all of a sudden this side business, this side hustle went from total anonymous obscurity to me being on stages and getting invites for stages across the continent and having a book offer and
wow,
like the things just blowing up. And so, well, I did that really well for myself. Why don't I do that for businesses? And I didn't know what on earth that would look like yet, but it seemed like the right direction to head in because I knew even if I tried to put resumes out there, it would still be a long process where, like I said, a bunch of the HR directors or whatever would look at my resume and go, well, he seems like a nice guy, but he's entirely unqualified
right.
for this type of position. So
yeah, that's interesting. Like you had nothing to lose to go all in on your own thing because it would have been just as difficult to kind of go the regular traditional route.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And so what do you mean when you say that you kind of blew up for yourself and you got like this book opportunity and stuff? Like how did that stuff come about?
That was simply just through learning how to market myself in a way that was focused more on their story, their problems, rather than me and my solutions.
And what were you offering at that time when it was just, or was it more of like just your story that people were interested in? Or was it you were teaching something? Like what was that part of that business?
Yeah, so there was an online course that I was selling. And then off of that, it was workshops and all-day seminars and things like that where people could bring me in to either to teach. Sometimes it was a room full of pastors from a bunch of different churches. Sometimes it was a church that would bring in all their leadership for the day. The thing was that I was presenting information. These churches knew that they had a problem, that they were losing young people, and they had no idea what to do about it. And so anyone who was offering solutions and had a bit of a track record of success, they were interested in hearing from. So yeah, I had a solution to a problem that they were facing with this church, the millennials leaving church thing. It just became, how do I message this? How do I package it so they actually want to bring me in?
Which is such a key point, actually, for anybody that's starting a side hustle or a business or whatever. It's like, figure out who has a problem and how you can solve it. And you have a natural business. But I think we so often get in our way and focus on all the like little details that don't matter, as opposed to like figuring out what the problem is and how you can package it. So, I mean, easier said than done, but it's just such a fundamental thing of like starting any type of business. So you now started doing this for companies. And so who do you typically help and how do you help them?
Yeah. So a bunch of my clients are in kind of the thought leadership space. They have online courses or they teach a unique approach to their niche. So a lot of the folks that I early on worked with were in that space. They were building their own personal brands and they were an expert in the thing that they did. So whether it was something to do with psychology or even for other marketers or other online course creators, they were an expert in that, but they needed someone else to actually bundle it together and package it into a story that actually caught other people's attention. So that was early on. And now it's kind of shifted to, I still love working with entrepreneurs, but it's a lot more tech that I work with as well, and something called SaaS, software as a service. So I don't work with these particular companies, but companies like Slack or what other ones would people be familiar with. So anything where it's a piece of software, but it's something that you use on a regular basis. So yeah, so I work with a lot of tech and SaaS companies now, but still love working with entrepreneurs too, because they're fun and that's who I am. And that's who I love working with too.
And what do you do for them? Like if an entrepreneur came to you or let's say a thought leader, like what do you provide in your package?
Yeah. So a couple of different things. If you ever heard of product launches or product launch formula, that's something that I do. So that's where you have a new product or product that you're kind of ready to put out there again, but you need all the emails that go with that. You need a sales page. You need landing pages and lead magnets and things like that, and the strategy behind how to actually launch a new thing. So that's one thing that I do, and that's more for the entrepreneurs, people that are still doing online courses or membership sites, things like that.
Right.
And then just general sales or marketing funnels. So again, a lot of the same stuff where it's the emails that you need to create, an asset or an opt-in and lead magnet where people are actually want to download your thing and give you their email address in exchange, landing pages, sales pages, website copy. So a lot of the strategy of how to actually make a marketing funnel work, and then quite often the copy or the words that actually go into that funnel as well.
Awesome. And I think it's interesting, like you left pastoral work, what you said 2.5 years ago?
Yeah, about that, 2 years ago.
I think it's just incredible. I mean, obviously you had started, like you had one foot in the online marketing world. And so you clearly had like developed some skills or knew where to start. But I think what people don't realize, and I really kind of like to show on the podcast, is that like things right now with the internet and businesses on the internet, they can move really quickly. Like 2 years is not that much time. And so like you now have a full on business that has nothing to do with what you've been doing for the last 15 years, And so that's incredible to like have that up in 2.5 years. I don't know. It blows my mind every time when I think of people have like completely changed their trajectory and now have this and like have clients that they're servicing and have like made it work.
Yeah, it sounds cliche, but the internet makes things possible to do them really quickly, right?
Yeah.
It also makes it possible to go the other way where your business just totally falls apart. There's a reputation problem or whatever. But the speed at which you can build a business, as long as you have the right strategy and the right plan and make the right connections and be intentional and purposeful about that, I mean, it's incredible. I've seen so many other people do the same thing where, you go for a day job where you're making, was I making 40, low 40s, to a job where you can make a hell of a lot more in relatively quick fashion. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it happens by accident. Most times it's that you're really intentional about spending the time to make sure that you've got, I just mentioned marketing funnels, that you actually got a proper system set up. You need to be focused on solving a problem rather than just shouting out your solution.
Right. Well, do you have any advice, like any books or any resources that people who maybe aren't as savvy with marketing and are trying to like start up a side hustle or a business where they can learn that kind of stuff to know, how to set up their marketing story and funnels in the right way?
Yeah, I guess the first place, the most obvious place for me is there's this book by Donald Miller called Building a Story Brand. So I mentioned a bit ago that I had trainings and certifications. So one of the things that I got while I was still working as a pastor was a certification to be a story brand certified guide. So that's one book where I'd send people right away. I don't get any money or anything off of that, but the whole framework essentially teaches you what I just said, that the story isn't about you. What you're marketing is not how great you are. What you're marketing is not even how great your product or solution or idea is. What you're marketing is they have a problem and they need to solve it, or perhaps you can guide them along to solve it. So, yeah, remember that your marketing story is not about you. It's all about them. And that if you try to force yourself down their throats, they're just going to reject you. If you tell them, or if you invite them into a story that's about them and their problem and them reaching success on the other side, they're going to be much more drawn to you and what you're saying. And then much more likely to actually be interested in what you have to offer and perhaps even buy it. So just remembering, that's one mistake. So working with a lot of early stage entrepreneurs, when I was early on, that was the biggest mistake, is you think that your story is so fascinating and that what you have to offer is so life-changing. And both those things might be true, but nobody gives a rip until you actually start talking about them and their problem. So just remembering to do that. And that's going to set you up for a lot more success than doing it the other way around.
Yeah, I love that. And where can people find you if they maybe want to work with you or want to know more? Yeah,
the best is just on my website, geoffkullman.com. I'm sure there's a link in the show notes somewhere.
Yes, there will be a link.
Yeah, so going on there, and then there's a button that says book a call, and that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'll send you my email address too. That can be in the show notes.
Perfect. That's very kind of you. Thank you. And I guess last question, like if somebody is going through what you were going through a couple of years ago and where it's, a huge identity shift and they're just obviously scared and they're in a place where they know it's not in alignment with them, but they're really afraid of all the repercussions that can happen. Like any words of advice or, things that maybe helped you in those places of kind of fear and stepping into your actual authentic self?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned we talked about integrity, right? And I think if you can't have integrity for yourself, it's difficult. I understand that, to make a transition, especially when it's about who you are and who you've always been in terms of your own identity. But that integrity piece will just gnaw at you until you just come out about it. So that might not be, it could be starting with your parents in my case. That still changed our relationship to this day. And so I get if that's not a safe space, but if you have a spouse, maybe they're your safe space. Maybe it's some anonymous person on some internet helpline where you can reach out first and they can give you some words of encouragement. Like you take those steps to lean into who you are and this identity shift. Otherwise, it will tear you apart. Whether I say it's courageous or not, I think I would see it as courageous in other people. So maybe I get your point.
I was going to say, we never see it with ourselves.
But have that courage, just take that first step, even if that's just dropping a hint here and there. I mean, because it'll just rip at you until you do. And the freedom on the other side, it's amazing. When you actually stop projecting this false image of who you are, or maybe it's who you used to be, but you're not anymore. I mean, the freedom, the extra amount of energy that you have because you're not pretending all the time, it's incredible and it's well worth it. On the other side, even though it's hard to get through, it's amazing on the other side of it. So don't deny that. Don't deny yourself of that other side.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us, Geoff. I really appreciate you being so open about something that I'm sure is very difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
My goodness, how good was that conversation? That is a tough one. And I'm so honored and proud of Geoff for really speaking about his journey and helping so many people that probably feel the same way. Here are my 3 takeaways. 1, you have to live with integrity to yourself. If you're not living a life that is in alignment with what you want and what you believe, it's okay to step out of that. 2, even though it's hard, the freedom on the other side is so worth it. I know we always focus on the things we're going to lose or the pain and the fear and everything that stands between us. But you know that cliche phrase that says, everything you've ever wanted is on the other side of fear. It's true. It is hard, but the freedom of being yourself and doing the thing you love is worth any hardship that you have to endure. And 3, there's always an opportunity to reinvent yourself. I know we like to think that we're stuck, like we've gone down a path for so long, or we've created an identity and that's just who we are. And it takes strength. But you have the agency, you have the freedom, you can reinvent yourself. You just have to have the courage to do it. I hope you liked this episode. If you did, reach out and let Geoff know. And I will be back next week with another one. Thank you so much for listening. I can't tell you how much it means to me. If you liked the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. It'll help other people find the show. If you want to connect or reach out, follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Lessons from a Quitter, and on Twitter at Quitter Podcast. I would love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.